All right, welcome everyone. Oh, can I be here? All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first seminar of the quarter. We're all very excited to have you. And we're very excited to have our first external speaker of the quarter as well, Dr. Rick Smith, who we'll introduce soon. This is our first CSDE fellow invited series of the quarter. Rick was invited by our T32 fellow, Delaney Glass, in anthropology, so that's very exciting. We have a couple of announcements. Remember, if you want to ask questions, to use the Q&A function, not the chat. Also, for those of you online, we're not in person. If you're not in person, you can get a very fancy CSDE punch card. Those of you who are in person, please remember to grab one, and after seminar, I will punch your card. If you attend 6 CSDE seminars in person this quarter, you will be entered in a raffle for a nice gift card for a local cafe on the app. We also have flyers for all of our workshops and working groups this quarter, as well as our seminar posters. So please come get that if you're interested. And without further ado, I will let Delaney introduce our speakers. Okay, hi everyone. I'm excited to welcome you to the first seminar of this year's series. And we're going to kick it off today with Rick's presentation, Dr. Smith's presentation. Settler Love is Breaking Our Hearts, and Emergent Ecologies of Health on the Western Grassland Prairies. Dr. Smith is a critical science scholar and geneticist, and is
Can you hear me on Zoom? Oh. Can you hear me on Zoom?
Can you hear me on Zoom? Is it better? What about now? Okay, perfect. Okay. Okay. So I'm happy to welcome everybody to the 2024 CSDE seminar series and kicking it off with Dr. Rick Smith. He'll be presenting his work entitled Settler Love is Breaking Our Hearts, Colonialism and Emergent Ecologies of Health on the Western Grassland Prairies. Dr. Rick Smith is a critical science scholar and geneticist and is currently an assistant professor of sociology and anthropology at George Mason University. He's an affiliate of the Women and Gender Studies program at George Mason, Indigenous Science and Technology Studies program at the University of Alberta, and SANE Canada. Prior to his current appointment as an assistant professor, he received his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin and worked as a postdoctoral scholar at the Newcomb Institute for Computational Science in the Department of Anthropology, at the Newcomb Institute for Computational Science in the Department of Anthropology at Dartmouth. His work examines intersections of genomics, feminist, queer, and indigenous science to understand how power relations become molecular. His recent work involves understanding population histories and urban ruralism, colonial sex, kinship, and family in the American South. Okay, turn it over to you.
As we're going to share the slides, and hopefully everyone will be able to see on Zoom. Catherine, can you confirm? How's that? Yeah, good. Okay, so first of all, thanks to Delaney for that introduction, and to Rawan and Maddie and others that have coordinated and made this visit possible. I'm super excited to be here today. Among those reasons is I rarely get the chance to present to such an interdisciplinary group of scholars who works on demography and ecology, which is what we're talking about. So it's really a pleasure to be able to engage and co-think with the faculty, graduate students, and spend some time together. All right. So as Delaney said in the introduction, my work is focused on the ways that shifting conditions of power become molecular. So I'm just going to say what that means. We're really excited. By becoming molecular, I mean that in a couple of different ways. I am trained as a molecular biologist and a geneticist, but I also am trained and situated theoretically as a queer feminist and indigenous studies of science scholar, which means that we track how scientific power has come to regulate us all as a form of Western knowledge. So by molecular, I mean literally molecular in the genetic sense, the ways in which social change impacts and reconfigures genetic variation and population structure on large scale. So we might think, my work thinks, for example, about the rise and decline of ancient cities, the spread of ancient empires, the clash of settler colonialism, the ways that that has drastically changed genetic variation on these continents, especially over the last 500 years. And conversely, the ways that what we can learn about patterns of genetic variation to reconstruct histories that have been robbed, erased, stolen from indigenous peoples over the last 500 years. That's one meaning of molecular. And the other meaning of molecular, I mean in a critical science sense and in a more theoretical sense. That is the ways that science has operated in direct relationship and indeed in collusion with colonial power over the last 500 years to radically remake what we think of as the word nature. So science in collusion with colonialism has operated to change dramatically how we think about the natural world and indeed the very concept of nature itself. And through that, all of the categories that we're going to be talking about today, which are we've come to call race, sex, gender, sexuality, and so forth. I'm specifically interested in how scientists govern the way that these categories are thought of as natural or biological categories, the way that they have somehow sprung out of evolutionary history, in which somehow rationalizes the social inequalities of the colonial society and the nation state that we all live in. So these are both of the terms, both of the meanings of the word molecular that I bring together in my work. So this takes a lot of forms, and I've already said a little bit about this, so I won't say much more. I work as a geneticist on population history with my people in northern Belize, looking at 3,000 years of migration, dietary reconstruction, pathogen reconstruction, and so forth, with a specific emphasis on resistance to Spanish colonialism and how people's resistance has also manifested in the population genetic structure of that region. Oh, sure. Yeah.
Please try, if folks online be responsive, we're going to try to unmute the laptop and use that as the microphone.
How's that? Oh, we need to turn volume.
Oh, gosh.
Oh.
I don't know how to disconnect it. Is this better? Yes. Okay.
Okay. And just a double check with my voice, is that okay? Okay, perfect. Okay, great. Thanks for that. Okay, so I also work with descendant communities in Berlin. So I kind of work on the fringes of the Spanish and then the Mexican colonial world, specifically because I tend to be drawn to contradiction. And these landscapes defy a kind of normative colonial analysis because colonialism was so complicated in these spaces, Spanish, French, Anglo, right? And so we have to really think kind of differently and creatively to explain population change in these regions and the taxonomies by which they're governed. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. Today, I'm going to focus mainly on my work in my home region, which is the Blackland Prairies ecoregion of north central Texas, where we are working on using a knowledge of the connections between sex, race, gender, sexuality, and land as a foundation for rethinking rural health in this region. And we'll talk about what that means as I go on. So over the last, to kind of get us started, I'm not going to say too much about this, but over the last few years, I've been working and publishing on the ways that sex, race, family, what Kim Tallbear calls settler sex and kin, sex, race, and family, and the ways that they get linked together. We also use shorthand like heteropatriarchy to describe sort of problems of these arrangements historically. How sex, race, family, colonial violence, and the conversion of land into something ownable property have been linked to masculinity and colonial violence over the last 500 years. And to get you just really quick into how I'm thinking about this, I want to draw on an example, one that I'm particularly obsessed with, but also happens to be close to home in Oregon. I don't know how many of you recognize Ammon Bundy and his family from their invasion of the Mahler National Wildlife Refuge a couple of years, well, I guess 7 years ago in Oregon. And they did this specifically in protest to the federal government not allowing them to graze their cattle on public lands. And so in protest, they invaded this wildlife refuge. And if you don't remember this, the federal response was really weak. So it was like a standoff for weeks, and they weren't removed from this landscape. It just went on and on and on and on. So I want you to think about the ways that like masculinity, in this case, a kind of iconic image of Western masculinity, is contrast to something that was happening at the very same moment in the Midwest. And that is the protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline on Standing Rock Reservation. These events were happening simultaneously. And I want to note this is a protest on Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples' own land in this region against this pipeline. And you can see the contrast in the like high level of militarized force marshaled against Indigenous peoples on their own lands. So really quickly, I just want to draw this contrast between these two moments to give you a sense of the ways that I am thinking about the connections between sex, gender, colonial violence, and rights, land rights. Okay? That is kind of the foundation of this talk. And I want to go one step further, just because I'm personally obsessed with Ammon for obvious reasons, to me anyway. And this will become relevant in the talk, I promise. We're going to theoretically deal with this, even if we have some fun. This kind of, as I've written about, this kind of iconic image of the Western cowboy against the sort of Western landscapes of the US and manifest destiny in the Western half of the continent. And I want to zoom in really close so that we can go big later to look at the ways in which this kind of masculinity is specifically scripted onto the land in certain ways. It's done so through marriage. It's done so through property ownership and the delimiting of that property as owned by a particular nuclear family, right? So what I want to say with this brief example is the ways in which this kind of masculinity is a governing force, and more than a governing force, it's a force of nature because it drives ecological change. This changes the ways that animals live, it changes waterways, it changes extraction of minerals from the soil, it changes all of these things. Ecosystem change is tied, at least post-colonially and post-colonially, since colonialism in the US, to this kind of sexed racial relationship. And that is the nugget of this talk. And then how we then work from this to understand how this land relation is a foundation for all of the ways that we think about health inequalities in this country. Or at least for me, I'm trying to theorize that. So how are we going to deal with this problem? Well, there's lots of ways we can deal with this problem. For me, as a scholar who's a geneticist and trained in science studies, I draw on a couple of things that I just wanted to define really quickly for those who may not be as familiar with these areas of theory. By queer science studies and by feminist science studies, which we also call queer feminist science studies, these bodies of theory are about analyzing how the production of scientific knowledge, the production of what nature means and how we should understand it, and giving science the authority or the hierarchy over society to define what that means. And specifically whose knowledge and whose bodies are legitimate in a colonial society. So this is about analyzing and disrupting those kinds of scientific power relations in the way that we are led to understand nature. That's related to work of a dear friend of mine and a co-thinker, Jessica Lepennick, who defines the recently emergent field of indigenous SDS, which is related, but instead of thinking about sort of masculinist objectivities or the ways that masculinity in ecologies, thinking about and analyzing and unsettling the relationship between science and colonialism. So these are the sets of theory or the sets of ideas that I bring in addition to genetics to the problem of colonial masculinity, settler sex, and family, and the way that it has changed the world around us. So I'm going to do a brief genealogy of kind of these ideas to hammer the point home. I'm drawing first on the work of Kim Tallbear, who has talked about the ways that settler colonialism, even as it was gendercidal in reconfiguring forcibly the relationships of indigenous peoples in this lands, imposed other kinds of social relations. It imposed and juridically tied marriage to private property. That is, it imposed compulsory monogamy and nuclear family, which, by the way, is a reproductive ecology for tying that to land, and converted appropriated lands into private property. And the point that Kim makes that I think is really important is that if we are thinking about ecological problems in the settler colonial world, we have to first understand the way that ecology is always tied to heteropatriarchy. And if that's the case, then we also have to deal with the ways that we love and disrupt the ways that we love in order to approach ecological problems. If sex and land are tied together, we have to disrupt them through sex and land together. And for this talk, I want to just emphasize why an analysis of settler sex and family is important and what some of the alternatives might be. And we'll get into that towards the end of the talk. And Audre Lorde, I'm drawing on just because she makes this point so eloquently in her Erotic is Power, that Black, feminist, indigenous, queer ways of relating have been the subject of suppression, precisely because they are viewed as profane, right? So I want you to think about the ways that we're governing the way that people relate, because the way that people relate is fundamental to land theft and remaking land as property. So Audre doesn't make that point, but she makes this related point that I think is really important, that because our ways of relating have been so suppressed, our erotic potential has been so depressed, erotic alternatives have been so suppressed, because they are so essential to how colonialism operates. And she says, and this is the sort of one of the things that I want to put forward or move towards in this talk, is that she says, and by the erotic, she means like a heightened or a transcendent state. And I love this because she compares it to painting a fence, to moving against the body of her lover as both being these kind of erotic kinds of moments. So she's not just talking about sex, she's talking about the heightened potential of what brings joy. And why does this relate to this talk? Well, she says, it feels right to me, or I know this is good and I know this is joyful, holds a pathway into into knowledge. Let me just read this exactly. She says, quote, "It feels right to me acknowledges the strength of the erotic, of our potential to live otherwise, into knowledge. For what that means is the first and most powerful guiding light towards any understanding." And she says, recognizing the power of the erotic within our lives can give us the energy to pursue genuine change within the world, rather than merely settling for a shifting cast of characters in the same weary drama. And for me, that means how do we actually tap into our capacities for loving otherwise as a way to think about, chart, and reconfigure ecological problems, demographic problems, and the health disparities that flow out of them. And what is the potential of the erotic? I'm going to draw on this, not really a companion piece, but kind of the indigenous feminist corollary to Audre Lorde's statement. What does the erotic do methodologically? How can we operationalize the erotic as a methodology, as scientists or critical scientists or wherever you find yourself? And Deborah Miranda writes in one of my favorite pieces ever, Dildos, Hummingbirds, and Driving Her Crazy, about 20 years ago, she says, for Indian women to express the erotic is as frightening to America as if the skeletal witnesses in anthropology departments and national museums had suddenly risen from their numbered boxes and begun to testify She says, the mythology of a nation built on discovery, democracy, and manifest destiny begins to fall apart, and the old foundation bereft of bones cannot hold it up. What she's saying methodologically to me is this. For us to operationalize or to live out our desires for other kinds of love and relating in the world is to destabilize the categories by which we are governed. It's to make ridiculous the idea that there are discrete evolutionary, biological, natural divisions between race, sex, gender, sexuality, and so forth. Ridiculous in the light of our actual desires in interrelation. So this, for me, is a methodological path. We can tap into this, into our own desires, my specific desire for Ammon Bundy, and why the hell am I drawn to that? Well, I think I'm starting to figure that out analytically, but we're drawn to particular problems. And so to lean into that and to analyze these relationships methodologically is what I think Deborah Miranda is speaking to here. And I want to go beyond the kind of normative to something that Jess Kolopenik and Kim Tallbear and those of us who run the summer internship for Indigenous peoples and genomics every year try to hit in our talks. I want to go beyond the sort of institutional or academic lingo of inclusion or diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's the first step. What I'm talking about here is actually trying to fundamentally transform the way that we think. That is, it's more than just queer people being in science and doing science or doing demography or ecology. That us doing that is fundamentally transformative to science. It can be. It can be. So Angie Willey says, in Dreams of a Dyke Science, another fantastic title, that the queer scientist will not only be aware of the interconnectedness of the personal and the political, that awareness can lead to, or she says will lead to, a fundamental transformation of science's very definition. That means to tap into these kinds of theories and this kind of knowledge and these practices, these empirical bodily practices, should transform the way that we go about analyzing, tracing, and reconfiguring these problems. So there's my brief genealogy of the kinds of theories that I'm drawing on in this talk. And we're going to return now to the problem of settler masculinity, colonial masculinity, and the ways that settler sex and marriage and kinship are used to drive ecological change and the health consequences of that. This talk is centered in the Western grassland prairies. I work in my home region of North Texas, just south of the Red River, the border with Oklahoma, if you don't know where the Red River is. And I just want to point out briefly that the other example that I'm going to talk about, some of our work, community-based work in Alberta with First Nations, that these landscapes are actually one cohesive grassland historically. So these are an interconnected ecology, one of the largest grassland ecologies in the world. And I'm going to start with my work in Texas. And I said I'm a geneticist, but I'm going to present demography to demographers. So that'll be fun. And then we'll talk a little bit about genetics at the end. So we're going to start first in Texas. And I want to go to 1821, which is the first Anglo settlement that became the large scale population of Texas that then led to the modern state that it is today. And I want to just talk a little bit about land allotments to be familiar with nearby Oregon and the way that land allotment actually works. And in Texas, beginning in 1821, Stephen F. Austin, the land impresario of Texas at that time, first colony of Anglos in Texas, defined land allotment in this way. He said, 640 acres should be allotted to every male settler. He will get 320 more acres if he brings a wife. He'll get 160 additional acres for every child and 80 additional acres for every enslaved person that he brings to Texas. So in this little nugget of a quote from Stephen F. Austin, I just want to point to the ways in which we're literally talking about the mapping of heterosexism, nuclear family, and racial hierarchy over the land. So every time that you fly in a plane, I want you to look down at this patchwork quilt of a land that we now live on and see heterosexism and see, right, the ways in which the land has been cordoned off in this way and patterned in this way, specifically because it is tied to notions of who is human, who is male, who is white, and so forth. And just that's my ancestor. One of my ancestors, I have 3 ancestors on this map, but one of them is highlighted there in the middle. So that's some of the earliest settlement. This map started about 16 years after the original settlers came to, or Anglo settlers, I should say, came to Texas. By 16 years later, it was hundreds of families. And I point to this map just because I recently heard Stephen Torgett, who's a historian, give a talk, and I just thought this was a fantastic point that he made, that you can see the sort of land allotment spreading out from southeast Texas, this plantation landscape that takes hold, the westernmost extent of the southern plantation landscape taking hold. And this is the Brazos River Valley up in southeast Texas. And what I love that Stephen Torgett said about this map is that this is called the connected map of Boston Colony. And what it is Stephen F. Austin, the land impresario of Texas, is making this map. So people will arrive, it's called Washington on the Brazos, which is the capital of Texas. They would arrive there and they would send these families out and say, go pick a plot of land. And they would go pick a plot of land, largely along the sort of river margins. And they would come back and report to him what the land looked like, where the rivers were, where the tributaries were, where their plantation had been set up, and what were its coordinates. And so I literally want to point out the way that the landscape of Texas, the first most important map of Texas in colonial period that's generated, and you're literally starting to see the land because it is being visualized through settler sex and family and racial hierarchy. This map is literally generated like a telescope. If the telescope is settler sex and family, it gives us this image. So this talk is mainly looking at post-emancipation histories because that's where we get the sort of inception of vital records keeping and records keeping in the state of Texas. And I just want to make the brief point that the history of plantations, at least in Texas, did not end with emancipation. In the history of Texas, once and on Juneteenth, which was Galveston Island, when the last of the enslaved people were told that they were free, the plantation economy in Texas, which remains one of the largest cotton plantation economies in the world, went on. And it went on because people specifically, or the government of Texas, began racializing a broader segment of the population in order to get people into cheap labor on plantations to maintain that economy. So we get the birth of migrant labor in Texas. We get sharecropping, we get tenant farms. We get the mass incarceration of Black men and then their selling of Black men back onto the sugar plantations that they were just freed from. So there are these new emergent forms of labor that happen after emancipation and well into the middle of the 20th century. That mean the plantation is still persisting as a political economy even in the region, even as its racial contours have shifted. And I want to make this additional point that this is just down the road from my mom's house in the town of Maypearl, Texas. It's exactly what it sounds like. That the footprint of the plantation kind of remains all throughout this region, the Blackland Prairies Eco region of Texas. And one of the things that I want to point out here is the way that plantation logics continue to govern this landscape, even as it has drastically changed into subdivisions as the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area kind of spreads out over the farmlands. And I'm going to do that just by pulling on a quote from one of my mom's friends who said, they used to grow cotton here. You see that image there on the right. And now they grow houses. The subdivisions kind of being put in the footprints of the former cotton plantation lands. And I think this is so astute because it's linking the subdivision kind of logic of nuclear family homes and aspirational whiteness as a very similar kind of ecological problem as the plantation itself was. So this is not something that's just over, it's continuing to be rearticulated in new forms. All right, let me get to the point of all this. How do we draw on these phenomena as a way to understand ecological change and ultimately to use that ecological change as the literal ground conditions for living and dying in society today? The sort of development and inertia and sustaining of health inequalities that persist to this day. There are some frameworks for understanding rural public health that I want to point to, places in the literature that have recognized that rural health is in free fall and has been for the last 70 years at least. And these frameworks are describing why rural people die sooner than their urban counterparts, at least since urban sanitation and stuff like that, since the middle of the 20th century. One of them is the rural mortality penalty model, and it just says if you're in a rural space, you're more likely to die than if you're in an urban space, and that's it. And then more recently, this other model called the Southern Rural Health and Mortality Penalty Model comes along and says, wait a second, this is geospatially heterogeneous. It's not just that all rural people die in the same way relative to their urban counterparts, but this is geospatially patterned and it's concentrated in the rural South. And you might notice, particularly along the Mississippi Delta region. Why is this? Public health researchers will ask. So while these public health models for understanding like mortality differences, the etiology of complex diseases in this region being so much more worse than in urban settings is valuable, what's unsatisfying about these kinds of models is that they are offering no explanation, no functional reason for why health disparities in these regions and in the rural South are so much worse than in cities or in other parts of the northern United States. Now, we could pathologize Texas all day. I want you to resist that urge. There is no part of the US that is not subject to these racial relations in some way, right? So it would be very easy and I think simple to go, oh yes, this is the Gulf South, this is the, but it really does rule all kinds of, strawberries are being picked in California by migrant workers, in Michigan by migrant workers, right? So this is a much broader problem than just the Gulf South. So what I'm trying to achieve in the rest of this talk is to think about this plantation history along with its sexual and racial politics as something that can help inform the intergenerational development of rural health disparities. How can we draw on this history that we know about these land relations and connect it to health disparities in this region in a way that is more satisfying than sort of basic spatial or rural urban kinds of comparisons? And I'm going to draw quickly here on Sylvia Wynter, Catherine McKittrick, and other Black feminist geographers for a moment by just pointing to the fact that this isn't a new idea. Black feminist geographers have been talking about plantation and plot and the ways in which that can help explain the world as we know it for a long time. And so I'm drawing on their work and centering the plantation as a threshold for a more historically coherent, maybe a better explanatory model of health disparities, in this case in rural Texas, although I think it can inform other kinds of plantation economies in the US and beyond. And then to come back to the title of the talk with Kim's Settler Love is Breaking My Heart, how do we get empirical? How do we get into the stuff, the materiality of what she said, Settler Love is Breaking My Heart? How do we get into the empiricalness of the broken hearts and the broken bodies that populate the landscapes of settler love, in this case, the plantation? So to do that, we started this is very, very fresh, very new project. Last year started a new Texas Rural Health and Heritage Project. The name still bothers me, but here we are. That is focused on the problem of rural health, the way that public health researchers have focused on health in the past, and centering local histories of colonialism as a way to understand health outcomes for farm workers in Texas. And I co-founded this project with Robin Nelson, who's a human biologist at the Arizona State University, and Austin Reynolds, who's a geneticist like me and also a bioinformatician at Baylor. Really quickly, this project has multiple phases. What I'm going to present to you today is phase one, which is where we're looking at what we're really interested in this first phase of the project was what happened in that first generation after emancipation, right? My grandparents, my great-grandparents, people who are no longer with us, who lived through the transition and plantation economy. What were their lives like? And so the first phase of this project was to draw on vital records, to draw on census data, public vital statistics, to get a sense of how, and they're really useful because the federal government, if you didn't know, is obsessed with farming and who's renting or owning, where they live, what their occupation is, and all that stuff. So it's a really valuable resource for understanding farm health in this early post-emancipation phase. And then phase two, which we literally started 2 weeks ago, what is a genetic human biology and functional genomic study of health among the descendants of farm workers who are still living in Texas. Because the point we want to make is the plantation can end. It's still shaping how people live and die today. So in this first phase, what we did was to begin to address this problem of the sort of unsatisfactory nature of the rural mortality penalty. We went to this first or second generation born after emancipation, and we were lucky in Texas that there began to be formalized in a time period of around 1880 to 1900, which is the fastest period of growth of farm tenancy and convict leasing and migrant labor in Texas. So it's a really ideal time period for this question. We collected death certificates with all kinds of records about cause of death, which is really messy, so I'm not going to talk about that data right now, but mortality data, marital data, racial data, all the categories that we're really interested in. And we paired that with census records to get a sense of, is the farmer own the land? Do they rent the land? Where in the plantation economy are they located in terms of the way that plantations historically operate? And we did that for about 2,500 people, and we are limited, unfortunately, in the categories that the federal government cares about, which are extremely normative categories, so it's hard to get at kind of diversity in gender or sexual expression, these types of things, given the categories that we have available at the time. And what we first did with this data was to look at, to test the rural mortality penalty. What we did was aggregate the data according to people who were living in the nearby city of Dallas. Oh, I should have said this in the last slide. We focused on 4 counties in the Blackland Prairies Eco region, one that holds the city of Dallas, that's the one labeled in black, and 3 rural Blackland counties that are historical cotton plantation rural zones. And so they're really geographically proximate to each other. And we first just grouped everyone by whether they were living in Dallas or they were living in one of the rural Blackland counties in Texas. And we just said, okay, do rural people die sooner than those who are living in Dallas? And the answer to that question is yes, they do die sooner than the people who live in Dallas. And it appears to uphold the sort of basic tenets of the rural mortality penalty. This is worse for rural people, it's worse for rural people in the South. What we did next was to take it one step further and say, let's pay attention to the historical context of this region being settled as a plantation region, and look at people who are doing plantation-based labor in this region and disaggregate rural people by whether they are doing that farm work or not. And what we found is that farm work, especially plantation-based farm work, accounts for almost all of the variance in rural health in this region. Not all of it. There's some unexplained variance in rural non-farm workers' lifespans, but almost all of the variance is explained by farm work. And that makes a lot of sense because social inequality in this region has been predicated historically for 200 years on farm work and justifying the sort of perpetuation of that political economy in the region. Now, this is average age at death. We know that that can be skewed by population growth. This is the late 19th century and early 20th century where we have a population boom. So we also need to do a survival analysis to understand the sort of trajectory of people's risk. And to make sure that that's not being too skewed by population growth. And what we see in that survival analysis is that indeed, rural farm workers have a much earlier fall off in life, much earlier risk hazard score for mortality earlier in their life, and that over the life course, they are the ones who are at risk of early mortality over the other urban segment of the population, as well as the rural non-farm worker segment of the population. So this is fun when we saw this result. Helping us, I mean, it makes sense to me immediately being descended from farm workers in this region. But it's helping us explain a lot, in a lot more satisfying way, what's going on. For time, I'm not going to talk about our hazard analysis, but I do want to break down by a sort of other metrics that we have. So race is something that's also tracked in census and in vital records. And we find that race remains as it was. I mean, in the plantation era, one of the defining characteristics of the extraction of life, right, from people in this region. And one of the most powerful predictors of early mortality still in Texas is this white-black divide. But again, we went one step further and said, okay, this has been said a lot in the literature. We know that people of African descent in the US are more likely to die sooner because of the racial system that we live under. We took it one step further and said, how does that play out if we again break it down by who's in proximity to farm and plantation-based economies? And what we found is that while there is inertia, even for Black people who are urbanizing the city of Dallas during this time, still a deficit in mortality for Black people in Texas, or at least in Dallas, in Texas, even as they move to urban spaces. But there's that sort of inertia that happens after emancipation. But one of the things that I want to point out to you is the widest divide between white and Black mortality in Texas remains in the context of plantation-based economies. And that makes sense because this economy was designed for that purpose. And it remains a powerful predictor of racial mortality in Texas. We also broke it down because Kim Tallbear said so, by sex and by marital status, which is also tracked in the census and the vital records data. And we found a lot of interesting things, some of which I'm not going to say much about, but we found that for married women, there is a significant loss of life relative to other unmarried women. One of my favorites is a woman who got divorced in her 20s and lived to like 95. She was like, haha, lived forever after she got divorced. So we see that widowed and divorced women, especially if this is age dependent too, so the earlier they got divorced or widowed, the longer they live. And women who are in nuclear state-sanctioned marriage of the kind that Kim critiques have a profound loss of life. I want you to look at the density curve of the men that are in tan in this graph under the married column. That there's a density shift, like a literal vampiric suction of life force, right? As they extend their own life force in the context of settler marriage. We again broke that down by plantation-based labor. And we find overall the data set, we look at all women on average, they do outlive men, what they do in every other part of the US on average. But if we looked at it by plantation context, we found that the most dramatic loss of life for women is when they're married and when they are married in a plantation setting. So there's no benefit, no life benefit to women who are living on and or doing farm work related to the plantation economy. I'm just going to say a snippet about this slide because I don't have time to get into it. We are seeing we selected this data primarily to look at and test the rural mortality penalty relative to the plantation. We didn't collect data that might allow us to do a more refined intersectional analysis. For example, what happens when you occupy multiple social categories that are shaping early mortality, such as being a married woman, being Black, and being a farm worker. And we are seeing some evidence that those layered sort of intersectional identities, I hate the word identity, but we're going to use it. Intersectional identities do shape earlier mortalities in a compounded way for Black women farm workers or Black women who are living on farms in Texas. So we need to do more work on this part of the study. All right, so that's one part. How are we doing on time? We're about at time. I'm going to walk y'all through the rest of this real quick, just because we can't end with that sad story. We need to think about the ways in which, as I open this talk, the ways in which desiring otherwise, having other kinds of love and relations and other kinds of land relations that are linked to our desire can be life-sustaining instead of deadly. Right? And so for this, what we're doing through the Indigenous summer internship for Indigenous peoples in genomics, which I helped co-found with Kim Tallbear and Jess Kolopenik. What we've been doing is using, and this is some of the genetics that I'll present, but just a snippet of, looking at the ways that Indigenous land management compared to monoculture, plantation-based monoculture, affects the soil microbiome. That is, how do we actually operationalize the way that people relate to the land and how that is constitutive of the ecology and the genetic landscape of a region. That's our cohort from 2022. And as I just said, we're using Minayan sequencers to sequence microbe genomes that are in the soil, and we're comparing this plantation landscape that I've been describing. People tell me that this is not a plantation because it's in Alberta. Incorrect. This stuff is still picked by migrant laborers. Doesn't matter if you don't live in the US South. it's based on that economy, right? And comparing that to a native prairie reserve in like a native prairie grassland remnant. So what the prairie would have been before it was transformed by monoculture. Again, I said we're using Menayon sequencers to get a sense, to characterize the critters that are living in the soil, and to get a sense of what the diversity, the genetic diversity of these landscapes are. I mean, really in brief, what I want to point to is that, as we might expect in a plantation monocultural environment, we have really low species diversity and overrepresentation of critters who are nitrogen fixers as they try to make a life in this landscape that they have been exposed to. The low diversity and an overrepresentation of some species relative to others versus the native prairie environment. And I don't want you to walk away from this talk going, oh yes, the pristine, pure prairie. That's not what I mean. Not at all what I mean, right? I'm just talking about land relations and the different forms that they take without the sort of purity politics of looking at the land this way. But we do see that there are a higher species diversity, there are symbionts present on the landscape, and this makes a lot of sense because of how we know this land is being managed. This is our cohort for 2023, and through a relationship with First Nations, urban First Nations in the city of Edmonton, Alberta, that my colleague Jess Kolopenik and Warren Cargo-McTagg, a Métis man in the region, we're working with First Nations in an urban context where land has been given back to local tribes, and we're using these soil technologies to characterize the ways that the land is changing in response to First Nations land management in the region. And I think I'll stop there. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for that wonderful talk. I think we'll move to the Q&A. Yes, they didn't hear me. Thanks for that wonderful talk, and we'll move to the Q&A. So if anybody here has a question, we can start with that, and then I'll also look on Zoom. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Yeah.
So going back to your analysis of the areas, you mentioned that some of your research was looking at epigenetic analysis. Have you gotten anywhere with that? Have you been able to find any?
Oh yeah, so thank you. The question was with the early mortality and vital statistics that we're looking at, and the next phase being the epigenetic and functional genomic studies, how far have we gotten with that? We've gotten 3 weeks with that. So we started this project literally a year ago in January, and we've done the vital statistics analysis and sort of set the foundation of that first generation. We just started last month collecting, and we're doing a broad study because I have a bone to pick with epigenetics too. I have a bone to pick with most things. But one of my bones to pick is that they lack kind of functional relevance in a lot of cases. And so we're pairing like human biology and biomarkers and immune markers and health phenotypes with epigenetics and functional genomics to try to link together the history through the gene expression to the phenotype in a way that I hope is effective. But we're like 11 samples in. So stay tuned. Yes.
Biomarkers are you using?
So my colleague, I'm not a human biologist, so I'll tell you what I know. She's collecting like immune globulins and cortisol. I don't know if she's measuring oxytocin, but some hormones, and then like basic biometrics like height, weight, sitting height, limb proportions, those types of things, to give us a sense of developmental. Sorry?
You're collecting whole blood?
Not yet. We started with saliva because whole blood epic array data is very expensive, so we'll get there. But for now, we're doing saliva stuff. So when we collect whole blood, we'll also compare. See if I can pull a test out of my brain. Compare how the whole blood responds to a pathogen treatment in cell culture. So it'll also give us a sense of like the functional biology of the immune system. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh yeah. Like, which one are you thinking about, Steve? Oh, here? Yeah.
How does this do the opposite?
It's been mixed in the human biology literature.
But how do you, so how do you define, the status is what the status looks like that?
The status is literally recorded as those words in the census and in the vital statistics. Those words exactly. Ages at death or average ages at death with the. That's right. Yes. Yes. Mhm. So one of the things that we did in our supplement was look at, like, do the aliens hazard modeling to look at life curves by marital status to try to get around some of this question, which I didn't present in this talk, but we are trying to pay attention to that.
I would need to repeat the question.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Steve asked, yeah, so there are these age-dependent effects, basically, with marital status. So if we look at this chart, for example, I think the single category, especially in the late 19th century, there's such early life mortality that skewed some of that category relative to others. And then you're right, like you do tend to live long. There's some bias in, especially the widowed category, if not the divorce category. And so we ran some Bayesian aliens hazard models to try to look at, do people's life curves actually fall off earlier in life? For example, if they lived to be 30 and divorced, was their life expectancy less because they were married, right, relative to just these categories? And the answer to that is, I think, yes. Yeah. Now, the human biology is mixed about this. And I asked Robin about this because I can't explain it. And I do have a bias about this myself. So what Robin said is sometimes marriage is protective and sometimes it's not, right? And so, yes, there are some cases in which I'm not even willing to concede this. I'm really not. That it doesn't have some health effects for everyone, right? Because marriage is not the like equilibrium of our like evolution, right? That's not a relationship that like should produce longer life than others, right? So I'm kind of taking aim at this sort of baseline assumption that that's like why we live longer because we're married, because I don't think that's correct. Marriage as we know it is like the 19th century on, right? But social relations do impact our lifespan, and social networks do impact our lifespan. One form of that is marriage. Sometimes that works out, and sometimes it does not. And in our data set, it does not.
Well, then I would just say childbirth or
Yes.
maternal mortality, particularly for a woman.
Yes, at this stage, that's right.
But,
and that's it's interesting because I expected more of that in the data than we actually see in Texas. So like maternal mortality is like less than 1%. There's a lot of child mortality, but there's not as much maternal mortality as I expected in this data set.
Right, but there's probably an effect of persistent child mortality that builds a burden of, a burden on the woman over time, right? So that might shorten their lifespan.
Yeah. Thank you.
First of all, this is really great stuff. I love listening to you, and I could actually I would love about like an hour and a half more of the theory section.
Well, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. I'm always like, say less. Yeah.
No. Yeah, it's brilliant stuff. I'm curious about your hypotheses about the through lines from the historic to the current.
Can you say a little bit more about like how do you connect like farm labor now to plantation labor?
As you're entering phase 2, how do you see that connected to like, do you have some theories in mind, or do you? This is not my field at all, so I don't even know.
Yeah, I do have some ideas, and I'll admit to some like my own subjectivity, right? Because I'm a descendant of tenant laborers in Texas. So the impetus for this project is literally my family's knowledge about how racial power works in this region in relation to the plantation economy. So the idea is the through line is most proximately from my own lived experience. That is the ways that the state spread out its form of racial subjugation and racial immiseration. In the eugenics movement especially, there was huge sterilization movements and mass incarceration of poor white people. Like, we were racialized in very similar ways, although not in the same historical trajectory as Black people, in order to maintain the plantation economy in this region. So my through line is, as the racial sort of model of a state and the way that it regulates labor in relation to colonialism, the plantation, changes, so too will change the sort of health outcomes and embodiments that flow out of that. For me, in the medical anthropology that I draw a lot of inspiration from, we have a lot of literature that talks about racial embodiments. But as a geneticist, what I'm always left wanting more of is an ability to disaggregate, like, self-identified race from health outcomes. And in most of our medical anthropological literature, those things are confounded almost totally with one another. And so Texas was an ideal place to start for me, one, because I know it, and it's one of the places that I feel like I can do health in a really informed way. But because its racial form is so weird compared to the rest of the plantation South, it gives us a way to actually look at the way that people whose racial subjectivity becomes suppressed or becomes the object of colonial power, the ways in which that should also change health outcomes in this region. So the through line for me is that there were 60% of people in Texas, and by 1930, this is my grandparents, were farm tenancy members. 60%. 1 in 4 farmers in the state of Texas was a farm tenant. And even more were migrant farmers and convict leasers and domestic, like, traveling farmers, but my grandparents did that as well, right? So this is, the descendants of that generation are in the millions in Central Texas. It's a huge population. And the idea is that if you are dispossessed of property, right, it all comes to property. When it comes to sharecropping and tenant farming, you are racially immiserating by stripping the right to property. Those things are all linked. When you do that, that has intergenerational effects on health outcomes that are passed down because you have less access to resources, less access to a beneficial marriage or any kind of marriage. And so the way that I'm thinking about this is materially the way that people have inherited this history through the generations. And I suspect we'll see effects of that, but I don't know yet. Does that answer your question?
Kind of.
Yeah.
And it got to.
Yeah.
I'm a economic stratification.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So I'm interested in the, like, interplay between, like, inherited wealth and smaller genetic things, which is as far as my knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, so Shay O'Brien, who's a sociologist, did almost like a companion, so we didn't know each other at the time, but she did like a companion study in Dallas about how circuits of wealth and privilege maintained a grip over land ownership, over property, over wells, all these things. What we're trying to do is kind of link those things. Like, are the people that I'm working with, the people who are sort of immiserated as plantation workers after emancipation, how do we link their sort of experience and their property and their access to wealth and connection compared to those in Dallas who own the land and extract the cotton and the oil, which, by the way, is also a plantation, because oil was struck on plantation lands. It's another plantation economy. And so we're trying to look at how that economic stratification took place and how it plays out over generations in Texas. But yeah, if you have ideas, I want to hear them.
Just briefly to follow up to Jenny's question, I'd like to know more, if you could just say a couple words about the communities you're working with there, like the descent communities, how you identified them, because you started with the archive work.
Oh,
how did
yeah.
you move to the community-based step?
Mm-hmm. So this is a community-based project that's rooted in multi-generational farming families in the Blackland Prairie ecoregion, most of whom I know personally. So it's starting with a local sort of social network and then building out from there. We're also working with a heritage farm association who are trying to maintain and, like, preserve the history of Blackland farming, and so that's where our local community relations are at. This is my family and friends, if I'm being honest. It's a lot of people that I know personally. Yeah.
Can you speak to, if you expect some sort of selective effect between the two time periods, families have to survive captured in your community-based study today, right? There's productivity and survival and migration.
Oh, can you say a little bit more? I'm not sure I totally understand the question.
Just that there might be some differences between your historical population.
Oh, yes, absolutely, there will be. And there's also a transformation, thank you for clarifying. There's also a transition in like the toxicity specifically of cotton agroindustrialism. It's the most chemically modified crop in the 20th century, and Texas is full of it. So there are new exposures that compound these problems. And then up until World War II, the New Deal in World War II, farm tenancy and sharecropping is the norm. After that, especially cotton labor is massively mechanized. There still are cotton picking communities in Texas that mainly pick cotton on small farms. If you didn't know that, not all cotton agroindustrialism is mechanized. People are still picking cotton by hand in the US on smaller farms. And so, yeah, we're looking at some of those effects and how it's hard, right? Because we have like an early, like post-emancipation group and then like 4 to 5 generations later. And so it'll be hard to get at some of those effects, but I suspect it will change.
Okay, I think we're at time, so we have to wrap up. But feel free to linger if you have other questions.
Thank y'all.
Would like a punch card.
Just in time. A few minutes. Yeah. How are you counting selection bias because those who survived all the generations? Okay, cool. You know what I mean?
Oh, I see.
Yeah, like how are you accounting for that for the people that are today? Because they had some strategies like to get through. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Nice.
That was great.
Ah.
Yeah. Special punch.
I know,
You
we
know,
need like a.
the train conductors have a
Yeah.
different one every time they punch.
Well, that's smart.
Thanks so much for having us. Really
Yeah,
interesting stuff.
appreciate it. Thank you so much.
I work on cause of death data.
Oh, cool.
Great certificates for that. So it sounds like you've been doing that too, and it just didn't make it into this talk.
I have that. Oh yeah, cause of death stuff. Yeah, we have recorded all that data, but I haven't figured out how to analyze it yet because it's such a mess.
And it's changed a lot.
Yeah, right. How they record it.
20 years that I'm working with. So over the last 100, I'm sure it's quite a nightmare to figure out what they even meant 100 years ago when they wrote something down.
Totally. Yeah, we're running into that part. We made a pattern of like I tried to analyze it a couple of times. Right. Grouped it by like category because there's so much diversity.
Is it digitized? How do you even get it?
And manually because the manually death certificates and the census data we could have gotten.
I have to say, test the old books of death certificates and say whatever.
It totally, yeah. So we can transcribe it and then we match the death certificate.
Yes. Jenny, who asked me the question about methods, is a data linkage expert leading an effort to link that data in Washington State.
But if you don't, wow.
So she's going to have not as ancient as that,
Okay,
but
cool. And I'll try to.
20 years or something.
I would be curious to see how y'all reckon with this problem. I had no plan. It's so annoying that I was like, okay.
Well, one of the things I was thinking of is the sideline in my death research was something called verbal autopsy, where basically in a lot of the world there's no death certificate. You want to know what people are dying of, what do you do? Well, you go ask, and to give it a fancy name, it's called the verbal autopsy. But there's a lot of debate about like how long can you wait and still go ask and get good answers. Do you have to ask for the week that it happened? Is that too soon? It's disrespectful. So you come back 6 months later, but people have forgotten. And so we've got some work that says, you can still get a lot of important information.
I'm so glad you came.
Looking forward to our meeting
I'll see you
later.
later. I have to run to another meeting. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I was gonna say if you were interested at all in taking a look at this data, you're welcome to it.
Yes, happy to. And if you're interested in asking somebody the verbal autopsy interview about what their grandpa died of, it's never been tried before. I mean, who knows what information is there, but like, none of the information is any good anyway.
Or where we can't get access to it.
Or where you have the death certificate, ideally for validation purposes, where it says something believable, like they had a heart attack.
That's right.
We're pretty sure they were grabbing the left side of their chest when they died. And so
Yeah,
it's
you're
like
right.
cardiovascular disease.
Especially some of these people who died in like the sort of further reaches of the rural space. They're dead before they get to the hospital.
I mean, even the maternal mortality stuff, it's like, did people know they were pregnant? Were people going to tell they were pregnant if it was not in the married category? Like, something just went wrong. We don't know what happened.
Yeah,
So,
it's like I tend to think, yeah, you're right. Because like maybe they didn't even record that they were pregnant when they died. There's only, I hadn't thought of that. They might have been so early on that they wouldn't know. Huh. That's great.
Anyway, really
Yeah.
Thanks for coming.
What was your name?
Amy, Abraham Flax.
Yeah.
Yes, likewise. I'll email you something about verbal autopsies, just in case.
Please do. No, I would love to see that. And yeah, if you're interested at all in taking a stab at this.
Yeah, yeah. See you.
It's there.
Thank you so much. That was a great talk.
Oh, thank you so much.
Jenny.
Jenny.
Yeah. Nice to meet
Yeah,
you.
thanks for coming and for your question.
Absolutely.
Some of that's gonna be in your data.
Yeah, maybe.
Because there's this stuff about, well, I don't know if it's in Washington State, but there's stuff about California based on immigration status.